Well, welcome to DEQ's podcast, The State of the Environment. I'm Todd Parfitt, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality and your host for the podcast. We started these podcasts last month to keep the public informed as to what is happening with the environment in the state of Wyoming. Over the next several months, we'll be talking about a variety of topics, including all of our divisions, which there are 7 divisions within the agency. Today, we'll be visiting with the administrator of the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division, Suzanne Engels. And so, Suzanne, give us a little bit of your background and experience that got you involved in environmental protection.
Thanks, Todd. Hi to everyone listening out there. As Todd mentioned, or Director Parfitt mentioned, Suzanne Engels, the administrator of the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division. I originally got into the environmental field, or had an interest in it in high school. There was an opportunity to get involved in a grassroots organization, and it just spurred my interest, and ended up going to college in Denver at Regis University, where I obtained my environmental science degree and then pursued a master's degree in environmental science and engineering at the Colorado School of Mines. I worked in Colorado for quite a few years before marrying my husband, who's from Wyoming, and found an opportunity with DEQ in the Casper office. Since moving to Casper, we stayed there for a year and then relocated down to Cheyenne. So I've been with DEQ as long as I have been married, which is about, coming up on 15, 16 years.
All right. Well, thanks, Suzanne, for that background. And we sure are lucky that you're part of our team. You do a tremendous job with your programs. Speaking of your programs, you have some success stories that have taken several years to kind of come to fruition. And these programs are all kind of tied together in some ways. And specifically what I'm thinking about is the cease and transfer program with the municipal solid waste landfills, the landfill remediation program, the underground storage tank program, and the corrective action account associated with those. So can you give us a little bit of the history behind those programs, how they came to be, why they're important for the state, and how we might differ from other states?
Sure. So you're right. There are a lot of success stories coming out of the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division, and they really hinge on funding coming out of the corrective action account. That account was established by the legislature in the early 90s. And it was created with the initial purpose to fund the cleanup remediation work at contaminated storage tank sites. And that program has been very efficient and effective at doing those cleanups. And there was an opportunity or a need for some additional remediation work within other programs, specifically surrounding municipal solid waste landfills, that the legislature saw that need and made some statute changes that allows for funding out of the corrective action account to be used to remediate and clean up contaminated landfill sites.
Yeah, so that corrective action account has certainly been a real valuable tool to make sure that we have the resources we need to address these important cleanup projects throughout the state. Let me take you back a little bit to the storage tank program. That was a very important program that was established back in the late 80s by EPA, and then all the work in Wyoming is being done by Wyoming, even though we're not a primacy state for that particular program. But what I'd like to do is visit maybe just a little bit about the storage tank program. How many sites did we start with? Why it was important for Wyoming to structure its program the way we have structured it versus some of the other states.
Sure. So going back into the tank history, there's quite quite a few sites that the program has cleaned up, actually over 1,600 sites in the state. And today there's, I believe, just over 250 sites that are still in active remediation. Now, every year there's a new site that we discover, a handful or less, that gets added to the list. But it was important for the state to take on that financial responsibility, because a lot of the gas stations in Wyoming are locally owned small operations. We don't have the large corporations running gas stations in this state. So are responsible for cleaning up contamination that their site causes. There was a need that was supported by the legislature to take on that financial responsibility as a state to help support those small operations.
So where does that funding in the corrective action account come from?
That account, the corrective action account, is funded using a 1 cent mineral royalty tax. That equivalent is about $10 million on an annual basis into the corrective action account.
So when you say the mineral royalty account, it's equivalent to 1 cent per gallon gasoline or fuel tax.
Yes.
That's the actual tax, but the money comes to the DEQ through the mineral royalty grant program.
Correct.
We had the success with the underground storage tank program and ensuring that we had a viable program that was workable not only for the state and remediating sites, but also workable for the smaller operators in the state. And as that program began to wind down, then we started to look at ways that we could use that fund for the landfill remediation program and other programs. So can you talk about how that progressed and where it is today?
Sure. Historically, in Wyoming, there was a belief that because we are an arid state in the arid West, that landfills, places where we dispose of our trash and waste, would not generate landfill leachate and have the potential to contaminate groundwater. However, as additional studies were done, that turned out not to be true. There was extensive studies and actually a citizens advisory group that was established by Governor Friedenthal to take a closer look at how landfills were operating, if they were generating leachate, making sure that they had appropriate groundwater monitoring networks. And that study determined that the majority of landfills that were unlined, that did not have a liner system, were contaminating groundwater. And so based on all of that information, the legislature created the landfill remediation program and the cease and transfer program, where municipalities could decide how they would like to manage their waste generated within their community and decide if they wanted to continue landfill operations and line future landfill cells, or if they would like to build a transfer station and close their local landfill. So the cease and transfer program provides that financial assistance, while the landfill remediation program provides the financial assistance to clean up and remediate the groundwater contamination at those leaking landfills.
So when we started that cease and transfer program, what we call the cease and transfer, it's really the closure and transfer, building a transfer station. We were looking at regionalization to some extent, and working through the Wyoming Solid Waste and Recycling Association and the municipalities, the owners of these small landfills. And as you mentioned, that was the question was, could a small community actually afford the costs associated with operating and then having to close and potentially clean up groundwater associated with these facilities? And through the cease and transfer program, that gave these smaller communities an option of taking their waste to a regional landfill or if not to a regional landfill, they could continue to run their own landfill, but would just have to find a way to make sure they could fund all of the expenses associated with that. So do you have any more you want to add to that?
I suppose I will add, back in 2009, communities were required to do what's called an integrated solid waste management plan, where they hired consultants to evaluate the waste generated and what was feasible for that community and what their waste management options were to present the communities with options. And based on those plans that were completed, the communities used that information to decide how to move forward and if transferring their waste to a larger regional landfill made sense. And I think a lot of the information presented showed that it was more cost effective to transfer waste to a regional landfill. And I'll also add that those plans are updated every 10 years.
And then also associated with the season transfer program, we provide an annual report and update to the legislature. So that in that report, it talks about how many we started with and what the projected costs would be. How are we faring with those estimated costs, and are we under budget, over budget, on target?
So you're right. We do submit an annual report in October every year, and as of October 2023, 35 projects have been funded, and splitting those out to the types of projects funded, there were 12 transfer stations funded, 22 landfill closures, and 1 carcass management project was also funded. So that remains, remaining on the list is 16 projects left, with a total estimated project cost of just under $27 million.
And we think that the resources that have been provided to us by the legislature and the governor are sufficient to get us to across the finish line, let's put it that way.
My fingers are crossed, but I think the projections look good based on the current list. Now, I will say that those estimated costs have the potential to change based on engineering estimates and the potential for inflation. So we'll work closely with the legislature like we have if there's a funding need, and with our annual reports, we keep them updated with what those costs are changing to.
Now, with the landfill remediation program, how many, there were 112 operating landfills, I believe, when that study was done. And of those 112 operating landfills, how many of those had indicated some type of impact to the groundwater, and how many of those are still in operation?
In 2010, there was a big report and study done that identified the facilities with adequate groundwater monitoring networks and sort of just the state of the landfills. And we estimated the remediation work to cost $226 million at that time. And we ranked them based on different factors and prioritized the list. And there was a clear distinction of the facility where there was a big break. And so instead of the top 10, we had the top 11. And we refine that list on an annual basis based on additional groundwater monitoring data, classifying the groundwater monitoring or classifying the groundwater at the landfill. And so we have worked with communities, and we are actively working on 7 of the highest priority facilities, and based on additional data, we were able to remove a few of those facilities from the list also over the years.
So then that takes us to the orphan site program. So can you describe a little bit about what an orphan site program is, and then how we're going about funding those orphan sites, because there's no responsible party?
Sure. So the orphan site remediation program was also established by the legislature in 2000. And the orphan site program focuses on orphan sites, like you mentioned, there's no responsible party or a viable responsible party to address the contamination at the site. And the contamination happens based on business operations or spills at the site. And so this program identifies potential sites, and then we work through that list to do assessments and determine the extent of contamination and what needs to be addressed and prioritize those sites. In 2015, the legislature allowed for distributions out of the corrective action account to the orphan site remediation account to fund the remediation at these orphan sites where there's no responsible party. So the state takes on the financial cost of cleaning up these sites.
About how many orphan sites are there that we're aware of in the state, and what's the estimated cost for that?
The list of orphan sites can change over time as we identify new ones, but right now we have 34 known sites on the list, and we are actively working on 12 of those sites. And so we're hoping with the distributions coming out of the corrective action account to complete remediation work at these sites and tackle the remaining list and continue work, because I'm sure there's more sites out there that we're just simply not aware of.
So, Suzanne, we've talked about 4 very important programs within the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division, and they're all intertwined in some way, either through similarities in the type of a project, whether it be the cease and transfer program. Some of the sites in the cease and transfer program are also in the landfill remediation program. We have the corrective action account, which is now funding 3 different programs: the cease and transfer, right, the orphan sites. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that funding gets distributed so that we ensure that we have sufficient or fund soundness, I think is the term that they like to use at EPA, is how do we determine fund soundness with the storage tank program in particular?
According to statute, we're required to maintain at least $2 million in the corrective action account to ensure that the storage tank program has the funds they need to do the remediation work at their sites. They're the first priority. So the tank program has that number 1 ranking for funding and making sure that their work and contract commitments are met. And working closely with that program, we forecast their needs each year, and then we look to what the needs are for our commitments in the landfill remediation program that we have. We have agreements with the municipalities that come into that program, and so we need to ensure that the funding is there for them. And then we then look to the orphan site program and what we can do with funds coming out of the corrective action account. But we're required to have at least a $2 million balance in the corrective action account, and we look at those projections on an annual basis to determine how much we can distribute out to those other programs and make that recommendation every fiscal. All of the programs that do remediation work look at risk factors, and we take a closer look at what the receptors are in the area. For instance, if there are any drinking water sources, private wells, surface water, groundwater distances, distances to residences. Really, those key risk factors that have the potential to impact public health and the environment.
Great. And then you talked about our performance on a national level. And I'm sure you'll want to say a few words of the great work that's been done by the tank program over the years, because they do rate very highly when we look at, as a nation, how well do we do with compliance with state and federal laws.
The storage tank program really hits it out of the park for compliance rates. They are either number 1 or 2 nationally. And last year, I think we came in second place to Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. So it's really due to the compliance efforts and outreach that the staff in the storage tank program do year round. That compliance assistance is really key to providing the operators the knowledge on how to meet the requirements and standards so that they can prevent the need for remediation.
And their compliance rate is well over 95%.
That's right. I believe the last reporting period was 95%, and the next reporting period is out. We've submitted our numbers to EPA. They have not been approved yet, but they're looking higher than 95. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah, and that's important because that keeps the cost down not only for the tank program, but provides additional funding or makes additional funding available to the landfill remediation program as well as the orphan sites.
That's right. The less remediation work needed in the storage tank program, the more we can fund in other programs.
Well, as we mentioned here, is you have terrific staff, not only in the storage tank program, but all your programs. They do a wonderful job.
That's right.
And they should be very proud. I'm very proud of the work that we do here, and you should be as well.
As I am. Thank you. Thank you for that recognition of the team, and that's the main reason why we're so successful.
All right. Well, thank you, Suzanne. This has been very informative, and I know you have other very important programs within the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division, and that will be for another day. So thank you. And for those of you out there listening, please be sure to sign up for our podcast notices by going to our website at deq.wyo. So thank you for listening, and we look forward to talking to you next month.